Hello and welcome to the Aviation Briefing with me, William Hallowell. In this podcast series, I speak with media and industry guests about the biggest topics and stories in aviation. Today, I'm joined by Ryan Ewing, who is the editor of AirlineGeeks, and he's joining me to discuss this week's probably biggest story in the aviation industry. Yesterday, Wednesday afternoon UK time, a person was killed at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. It's been reported that they fell into a running jet engine. So Ryan's going to join me to give us a bit of an update into the story. So Ryan, firstly, thank you very much for joining us.
Absolutely.
Can you give us a bit of an overview of what we know so far that was initially reported yesterday, and perhaps any developments that have come out in media reports, this morning and afternoon?
Yeah, so it seems that the latest from the incident in Amsterdam was that the individual was somehow ingested or made contact with a running jet engine on an Embraer aircraft operated by KLM Cityhopper subsidiary. It's unclear whether this was sort of a ground crew worker or whether it was a passenger, perhaps boarding. But the latest that we know, with the details have been a bit mum, it seems, from the local authorities. But the latest that we know is that an individual made contact and was ingested potentially into a running engine on an Embraer aircraft.
Do we know much about the identity of the deceased? Has any more information come out about them? I mean, we've had reports that it potentially was a ground handler that was involved in the pushback operation, prior to KLM, the airline, which is involved in this incident before the takeoff of that aircraft. As far as the individual concerned, I mean, what do we know about them?
Yeah, that's kind of what I've heard too, William. I think it would be the most likely scenario would be that it was a ground crew worker operating in the perimeter of the airplane in which the aircraft engine was running. I think it'd be very unlikely for something like this to be a passenger, even if they were boarding the air stairs, because of course the engines aren't running while that's happening. That would be a fairly significant safety risk.
We were talking just before the recording of this podcast about incidents like this. I mean, in your experience, what usually happens in instances like this where, perhaps an airport worker or ground handler is fatally injured in an accident or a collision or something like that, or on the airport ramp? I mean, what usually happens in these scenarios, and what can we expect to know kind of going forward?
Yeah, the airport ramp's a dangerous place. I've worked on one myself, and I can tell you that it's no joke. You have to keep your eyes and ears open at all times. This has happened before. It happened recently, a couple of years ago in Mobile, Alabama, where a ground crew worker was ingested into actually another Embraer aircraft's engine. Um, it, it's happened a couple times before that as well. It's not an uncommon, it's I wouldn't say it's a common occurrence, but it's certainly not something that is not happened before. This isn't new, and again, it's really important for ground crew workers to keep their eyes and ears open when they're on the ground working around airplanes. There are instances where the pilots will opt to keep one engine running if there's a APU that's broken. But of course, that's indicated with the beacon light on the airplane to tell people around it to stay clear. So yeah, it's happened, and it's happening again. And I think it's really important that regulatory agencies also keep in mind that ground crew workers are very vulnerable.
Going on to, I mean, I would like to touch on the kind of safety element in a moment, but going back to kind of media reports of what we know so far, obviously I'm not going to draw you into speculating about the incident, but according to the Dutch Royal Military Police, it's been unconfirmed whether this was an accident or, even a potential suicide, which is quite an interesting thing for them to come out and say, purely because surely that kind of generates speculation that perhaps it actually was a suicide. Again, we don't know, but that's what they've said. It almost, kind of hints at something, more than it was a simple accident, that, an instance that went wrong at the airport.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's definitely interesting that they came out that early before any other investigatory agencies came out. But if it was, it's really unfortunate. But even if it was, it's hard to say, right? Because I don't want to speculate, but it's definitely interesting to see another agency coming out and already speculating on it, or sort of even hinted at something without doing, a due force investigation. So, who knows?
I mean, I suppose, the Royal Military Police, the Dutch Royal Military Police, are leading the investigation as far as I'm aware. So I suppose, we'll just have to find out more as they bring it. But as I say, so moving on to the kind of safety element, what are the implications of this incident? And I suppose incidents before it, like you say, this isn't a standalone occurrence. These sorts of things have happened before. What are the implications, not just for, the ramp workers, but also, the ground handlers they work for, their airline partners, you know, things like this shouldn't happen, should they? I mean, fatalities are obviously the worst possible thing that could happen in an instance like this. As you say, airports are very dangerous places. What kind of reaction can we expect from the industry, perhaps specifically from Schiphol? And if it was a ground handler that was killed in this incident, from that particular company as well?
Yeah, I think unfortunately a lot of aviation safety is written in the blood of prior incidents, and incidents like these are no exception. Like I said, the airport ramp area is a very dangerous place. It requires diligence, and I think from a company perspective, I, I would I would think they would take another look at their SOPs and perhaps remind staff about running engines, the dangers of running engines, in addition to what to look for, the beacon light on the airplane, making sure that you're steering clear of the engines. And there are instances where maintenance staff have to get very close to a running engine, to make sure they can sort of hand start it, as they say, where they sort of manually crank it so that it can start. But of course, they're doing that after extensive training, and making sure that they're clear of the front side. They're very dangerous, and there's no question about that. And I think, again, in the U.S., our new FAA reauthorization bill sort of put in additional protections for ground crew workers, and I hope that the rest of the world can see that and perhaps adopt it if they haven't already.
I mean, it has been about around 24 hours since the incident, but on the kind of safety culture element, as I say, we don't know a huge amount about the incident so far. It doesn't seem much more information has come out today, perhaps. But if it is determined in an investigation that, this was an issue to do with safety on the ramp, or perhaps procedures, regulations not being followed, what does that say about, a potential safety culture in ground handling? Because I was at IATA's ground handling conference in Iceland last month, and they were placing a huge emphasis on the need for safety on the ramp and improving it through things like training. How are these elements potentially linked to this incident as well?
Yeah, I think it all goes back to training and on the job training, especially being out there with the subject matter expert, making sure you're knowing what to look for. I've always said that a PowerPoint computer-based training can only go so far, but hands-on experience with a lead or subject matter expert is substantially more beneficial for a lot of people. And I think in this case, it's no different. And just showing trainees what to look for, what's not normal, what is, and really just teaching them kind of what diligence is required and when.
So looking forward then, what can we expect to hear perhaps in the next few weeks? Obviously, I suppose an investigation is the first thing. Um, you know, in your experience, how long are we going to have to wait to hear the full details of this incident? And what, I suppose, learnings as well can the industry have, the ground handling industry, particularly in aviation? What are they perhaps going to have to learn from this incident?
Yeah, I think the answer to the first part of your question, it could take a couple months at the very least to get it even a little more detail into this as agencies start looking at it. But I think depending on what recommendations are made, I think ground handling companies can certainly benefit from adding in some additional training layers, uh, some recurrent training to remind people of the dangers of aircraft engines, and certainly more than that. It could go down to aircraft maintenance. How do aircraft mechanics steer clear of engines, and maybe letting them teach a course about the dangers of it. So who knows? I think there's a ton of lessons to be learned from this, and ground handlers will definitely have to take another look at their operations.
Well, look, Ryan, thank you very much for joining us on the aviation briefing. It's been interesting getting some updates on the situation, getting some insights, obviously, into the background and perhaps, as I say, how things are going to move forward. So once again, thank you very much for joining. I know it's early in the morning for you. It's late in the afternoon for me. So I appreciate you getting up early to speak to
Of
me.
course,
So yeah, thank you very much.
of course. Thank you so much.
This has been the aviation briefing with William Hallowell.